What's up YouTube? I'm David Warren and welcome back to this week's video. Today we are diving into what questions I would ask if I had to start CRNA school all over again in 2024 during my CRNA school interview. These are the top questions that I would suggest you ask as well. If you're new here, consider subscribing. My channel is all about being in CRNA school and being a nurse practitioner. Before we dive into the content for today, I want to share with you a promotion by Lecturio. Lecturio is an online-based learning platform, and they are offering the Back to School campaign from August 12th to August 31st, and they're offering 50% off all of their premium plans. I'm going to put a link below. Check that out if you're interested in purchasing any plans from Lecturio. Okay, here are the top 10 questions I would ask in my CRNA school interview. These are not really in any area of importance. These are just things that I have thought of over the past few months. Looking back, if I had to apply again, if I were going through the interview process, these are the top questions that I would ask to ensure that I'm going to a program that would match my wants and my needs. And there's a part of me that understands that CRNA school is super competitive and you're just gonna go wherever you can get in. But I also understand now, after being in a CRNA program, I really ended up at the best place possible for like me and my goals and my wants and my needs. But I also understand that like you're gonna be paying tuition, roughly $80,000 to like $150,000 depending on what program you go to, some cheaper, some more expensive. And if you're gonna be paying that much money, you really wanna get out like the things that are important to you. And over the past 3 years, these are the things that I have found to be most important in CRNA school. Okay, so number one, I've got them listed on my iPad here, so I'm gonna intermittently look down so I don't miss any of them. Number one, how many average cases do the nurse anesthesia residents graduate with in your program? This is a good starting point. You want to know how many average cases do people get. Is it the bare minimum or is it significantly more than the bare minimum? You really don't want to go to a program where you're getting 650 cases, which is the bare minimum to sit for the national certification exam as a CRNA. You really want to be getting way more than that. People from my program are graduating with anywhere from 1,000 to 2,000 case numbers. And I guess I don't really know if that's average or not. If you're in CRNA school, if you're a CRNA, comment below with like how many cases you graduated with and what program you went to. This would be a good way for people to kind of see how many cases people are getting. And I'll give you an example. At some of the clinical sites I've been to, there have been other residents from other programs, and some of them have significantly lower case numbers for where they're at in the program compared to me. So, and then some of them have a lot more. So it really just depends. All I would say is go to a program where you're not getting the bare minimum. Number two, will I have a home clinical site or will I be traveling for clinical rotations? And I think they're both fine. You just need to know what you're getting yourself into. Like, are you gonna be traveling every 3 months? So at my program at National, we travel every 3 months to a different rotation, with some exceptions, like where I'm at right now in rural Arizona, I'll be here for 9 months, so I'm not having to travel much. But other than that, we're traveling every 3 months for rotation. Some other programs, you're gonna be at the same clinical site for all of your rotations. So it's really good to know going in. You can probably find that out even before you get in the interview. Do I have to travel for rotations, or will I be at like a home site? So another good question to ask. Number three, how many regional anesthetics do nurse anesthesia residents graduate with from your program? Are they graduating with the bare minimum, like 10 to 15 regional blocks, which you probably don't even know how to hold the ultrasound probe after 10 to 15 blocks, or are they graduating with 200, 300, 400 blocks, or somewhere in between? You really want to know that, because depending on where you work, especially if you work in like an outpatient surgery center and you're doing a lot of ortho surgeries and you're doing blocks, you really have to be competent at blocks. On a side note, I've been browsing GasWorks to figure out what I want to do with my life after I finish school, and there are a lot of positions that say regional anesthesia experience required, meaning you need to be proficient at regional anesthesia. Some jobs say willing to train regional anesthesia if you don't already have that. There are courses out there, there's ways to get that training, but it's really good if you're going through your program, especially for your first job or so, if you're proficient in regional anesthesia and that's something you're gonna be expected to do, that you already know how to do it. So ask how many regional anesthetics are nurse anesthesia residents from your program graduating with. Number four, Do I have dedicated time off to study for boards during clinical? And this is especially relevant if you're in a front-loaded program like I was, meaning you're on campus for 15 months or a year, however long it is, just doing the didactic work, and then you start into clinical and you're just doing clinical rotations. Are you gonna be doing clinical 7 days a week, 5 days a week, 3 days a week? Are you gonna have dedicated time to study for boards? Are you only gonna be studying at night and on the weekends? A really good question to ask. How am I gonna be able to prepare for the board exam on top of an already heavy clinical load? Is that going to be expected that I use my personal time on like nights and weekends to study? Again, just a good question to drill down and find out, do you have dedicated time to study? All right, number 5, do nurse anesthesia residents have to take the C exam during the program? And if so, is there a minimum score required? And this is also important to know because like in the program that I'm at National University, we have to take the C exam twice, and you have to attain a certain score both times to progress in the program. Otherwise, you're booted. And so it's really good to know, is there a minimum score I have to use? Do they even require the C exam? And just for a little background, if you're not familiar with that, the C exam or the SEE exam is the self-evaluation exam, and it's 240 questions, and it's essentially like a mock board exam. It's kind of to gauge where you're at, and we had to take it right after didactic before we got into clinical, and we have to take it again in a few months before we graduate from the program, and make a certain score on that to pass and to graduate from the program. So it's really good to know, is the C exam required, or can I just take it and kind of see where I'm at? It's really good to use that kind of as a gauge to know, is there a certain score I have to make? And if so, what is the score? And how many times do I have to take it? So good thing to ask before you start. Number 6, what percentage of your sites are CRNA only practices? This is really interesting because I don't know, 80 to 90% of our sites at National are CRNA only sites, and it's been really cool to see or to be in that environment where CRNAs function independently to the top of their scope. They do everything. We start central lines, we start art lines, we do all the regional anesthetics, we do all the spinals, all the epidurals, running the case of solo. It's good to know, what kind of practice environment am I going to be in? And I didn't really think about this when I was applying. It didn't really cross my mind, but it's good to know, if I go into the hospital, am I going to be supervised every day? Do I have to run everything by a physician anesthesiologist, or will I be able to run my cases independently? Will the CRNA come in during emergency and extubation and during induction, or, what does that look like? And knowing how many sites are independent kind of gives you an idea of the focus of that school. If you are, this is kind of broad generalization, if you're on the East Coast, most all of your sites are going to be heavily restricted. You're not going to have many independent sites. And there's some downsides to that. Sure, you have extra sets of hands to help, but when you're training, you really want to be able to do everything. You want to do your own pre-op assessments. You don't want to rely on somebody else to do that, because when you graduate and you're at your first job and you're independent, if you're an independent site and you are trying to pre-op your patient, you've never done that before, there's just confounding things that happen. You need to be able to work independently. And a good question to ask, and you don't have to say anything more, the answer to this question will give you a really good idea of the focus of the program. How many independent sites do you have at your program? All right, number 7. If clinical sites are medically directed, what are nurse anesthesia residents not allowed to do? Meaning, if you're not at an independent site, you're at an ACT site, which is an anesthesia care team, which is where there's usually medical direction, and medical direction is a billing term, meaning that there's one physician anesthesiologist supervising up to 4 CRNAs or anesthesiologist assistants. And so you really want to know, if you're in that environment, what can I not do? Do I push my own induction drugs, or does the physician push the induction drugs? Do I do my own blocks, or does the MDA do the blocks out in pre-op? Do I do my own pre-op assessments, or does the MDA do the pre-op assessments? You really want to know, what am I not allowed to do? And this kind of goes back to the independent sites and to how many regional anesthetics you're going to have in your program. If you're at this heavily restricted site and the MDAs do all the blocks and they don't let the CRNAs do any blocks, you're not going to get really good training there, and it might not be a good program for you. It really depends though, do you want to work in that environment? Do you ever intend to leave whatever environment you're at, where there's heavy restriction? If not, and you want to work in that environment, then sure, but it's going to be really challenging if you graduate and you want to be in an independent site and you've only trained in these super restrictive environments. It's going to be hard to find a job where you can function independently. Most, from what I've seen, all these independent sites want people with independent experience or people that have trained in independent experience places. And that's what's really cool about training to be independent is when you graduate, you have a choice. You can choose to work in these heavily restricted sites if you want to, and some people might want to. You want to live in New York City, you're going to be probably in a medical direction site. But if you want to live in like rural West Texas or rural Arizona or New Mexico, you can work at an independent CRNA only site, but you need that training to be able to get there. And that's kind of the point. What kind of environment are you going to be training in to try to get that experience, if that makes sense? All right, number 8, will there be other learners at my clinical site competing for numbers also? And this kind of goes back to how many cases am I going to get? And this all kind of has the same theme. All these questions kind of have the same few themes. Will there be other learners trying to get those cases as well? Is there a physician residency program for anesthesia? Are there other nurse anesthesia residents who are going to be at these sites? Some of the sites that I've been to, one in particular down in South Texas, I won't name any names, but everybody knows where it's at. And at this particular site, there are like at least 6 or 7 different CRNA programs that send their residents there. And so every single room has a nurse anesthesia resident in there. And thankfully, it's a big enough site that you're going to get your numbers no matter what. But if you get a smaller site where maybe there's not enough rooms to go around one day and there's too many residents and you get a day off, which is fine, you get a day off, but in the reality of things, like, is that going to be your entire training where you're trying to compete for these numbers? So it's really good to know, will there be other learners at the site? Or like the site that I'm at now, there are 2 other nurse anesthesia residents. We have 5 ORs, OB, and some like endo rooms, so it's not a big deal. There's plenty of cases to go around, but it would be a different story if there were like 6 nurse anesthesia residents here and we were all trying to be off once a week because everybody needs to get their cases. So it's really good to know. Will there be other people competing for those numbers there? All right, number 9, do you have a business of anesthesia course? This is really interesting because, and I didn't know this really until just about 3 months ago. In my program at National, again, about 4 months away from graduation, last quarter, our DNAP class was on the business of anesthesia, how to bid for an anesthesia contract. What does that entail? What do you look at when you're trying to bill for anesthesia? What are time units? What are base units? What's the payer mix? All of these things that, again, it all depends on where you're going to end up working. Like at this site where I'm at now, it's a fee-for-service site, meaning the CRNAs bill for what cases they do. They're not paid an hourly. They're not paid like a salary. They literally bill for the cases they do, and that's their reimbursement. If they are off a day and they're not doing any cases, they don't get any money that day. But it's really cool because they make about $400,000 to $500,000 a year here. But you have to know the billing. You have to be able to look at the schedule when it's your day to pick your room and know, like, based on the patient's insurance, based on what procedure is going on, how much is that going to be reimbursed? And in this business of anesthesia course, it taught us exactly that. And if we wanted to bid on a contract and start our own anesthesia company, we have the tools to do that. So it's a good question. Does your program offer a business of anesthesia course that teaches anesthesia billing and how to bid on contracts if that's something that you're interested in the future? And it's good information to have. So that's a big thing, and I didn't even know it until about 3 months ago. All right, last but not least, number 10, tell me about the DNP or the DNAP project. Is it a group project? Is it individual? And when will it be completed? And this is huge because there's so many things that go into the DNP or the DNAP project. Is it done before your clinical starts? Some programs you get it all out of the way before you start your clinical. Some programs you're doing it during your clinical, like mine at National. We have our DNAP class and our clinical class. So during our clinical year and a half, we're doing the DNAP project on top of everything else. And so it's good to know, like, what are the stresses that that's going to create when you're trying to do, 5 days a week of full-time clinical, and you're trying to do this doctoral project. Is it by yourself? Is it in groups? Do I get to choose the topic? Are topics chosen for me? All these questions are really pertinent. And again, I didn't think of that until I got into the thick of it. And I'm like, oh, that would have been a good question to ask during the interview. So yeah, those are the top 10 questions that I would suggest asking in your CRNA school interview. Again, it's not a comprehensive list. If you're in CRNA school now, comment below what questions would you ask if you had it to do all over again. And it's funny because looking back now, like these questions weren't even on my radar when I was applying for CRNA school. I assumed all CRNAs got the exact same education. That could not be further from the truth. Most didactic phases of programs are the same because we all take the same standardized exams, but the clinical is what sets programs apart. If you're in a heavily restricted site versus an independent site, are you doing all the regional anesthesia? Are you doing no regional anesthesia? Are you putting in art lines and central lines? Or are you only getting the bare minimum? Those are things you have to consider. And again, I thought it was all standardized. It's absolutely not. There are wide variations in clinical training for CRNA schools. These are the top 10 questions I would ask. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I'll see you next time.